Block 1. When help turns into harm. The day I hired Charlotte felt like a turning point. After 18 months of single motherhood, I was on the brink of collapse. My husband Mason had died in a car accident when our son Henry was just 6 months old. In the blurry whirlwind that followed, the funeral, the insurance calls, the silent nursery, I learned how to grieve while feeding bottles at 3 a.m. I was 29 and already carrying the weight of a life I hadn't planned for. By the time Henry turned 2, I was back at my architecture firm full-time. I'd fought hard for that return. I needed the work, not just for money, but for sanity. For something that reminded me I was more than grief wrapped in a baby blanket. But with daycare hours too rigid and babysitters inconsistent, I needed stability. I needed someone who wouldn't just show up on time, but who could care. Enter Charlotte. She came recommended by a neighbor in our Pasadena cul-de-sac, late 30s, tall, graceful, with eyes that held steady and a voice that instantly soothed. She wasn't the bubbly Instagram nanny type. She was calm, confident, experienced. Her resume was impeccable. 6 years with a family in Brentwood, a background in early childhood development, spotless references. And Henry loved her. Within a week, he'd stopped crying when I left for work. Within 2, he was running into her arms before I could even say goodbye. I felt relief, gratitude, even envy. Charlotte moved through my house like she'd always belonged. She learned the creaky spots in the hardwood. She sang to Henry in French. She reorganized the pantry by nutritional density. She cooked dinners without being asked and left notes about Henry's milestones. Henry said a full sentence today. I want to play blocks with Charlotte. So proud. Henry asked me if clouds are soft. I told him we can read about it tomorrow. She was efficient, caring, composed. She was exactly what we needed, until she wasn't. It began with the shoes. One morning, I was rushing to get Henry dressed when I noticed his tiny navy blue sneakers were gone. In their place, a new pair. Expensive leather ones, European-made. Not from Target, where I usually shopped. Oh, I picked them up yesterday, Charlotte said, smiling. He needed something sturdier. I noticed the soles were wearing. It felt off. Not the gesture. The decision. I hadn't been asked. She'd just replaced them. Without a word. Then came the lullaby. One night I came home late and peeked into Henry's room. Charlotte was sitting beside his crib, stroking his hair and humming. I froze in the doorway. It wasn't just the intimacy of the moment. It was the song. She was singing my lullaby. The one I'd made up. The one Mason used to sing with me, off-key, while we swayed with Henry wrapped between us. How do you know that song? I asked, stepping in. Charlotte blinked. Oh, Henry sings it sometimes. I just picked it up. I didn't say anything more, but something twisted in my chest. I tried brushing it off. Told myself I was being overprotective, controlling, jealous even, of the bond she had with Henry that I didn't get to see during the day. But the line between help and replacement kept getting thinner. She started referring to Henry as our boy. She posted a photo, one I hadn't IT approved, of him in the park with the caption, "My little sunshine." Friends started texting, "Is that your nanny's page? It looks like she's his mom." I asked her to take the post down. She said she was just proud of him. But something in her smile had changed. It lingered too long. Then came the doctor's visit. I had scheduled Henry's flu shot weeks in advance. Charlotte knew. I'd mentioned it multiple times. But when I arrived at the clinic, the nurse blinked at me. He already came in, earlier today, with his mother. I stood frozen, heartbeat hammering. "I'm his mother," I whispered. She looked confused, then concerned. She had his records. She signed consent. I'm so sorry. I drove home with shaking hands. When I burst through the door, Charlotte was in the kitchen, humming and chopping carrots. "You took him to the doctor without me. He seemed fussy this morning. I thought it was best to just go." "That wasn't your choice." "Well, someone had to make it." There it was. The slip. The claim. That night I changed the house alarm code. The next day I started searching for a replacement. But by the time I acted, it was already too late. Charlotte wasn't just caring for my son anymore. She was possessing him, and she had no intention of letting go. Block 2. Lines crossed. The morning after I decided to replace Charlotte, I called an agency. Discreet, professional. I didn't want drama. I just wanted a transition plan. Someone who could shadow her for a few days, make it a clean break. But when I got home that evening, Henry wasn't in the playroom. He wasn't in the backyard. He wasn't anywhere in the house. I panicked, calling his name, running through the hallway, flinging open closets like some absurd horror movie. "Henry? Henry." My voice cracked. Then I saw the note, taped to the fridge. "Gone to get new shoes for our boy. Back by 5. C." My stomach dropped. Not because of the shoes, again, but because the clock said 6:12 p.m. They were over an hour late. No text, no call. I was about to dial 911 when the door opened. Charlotte strolled in, smiling, holding Henry's hand. "We ran into a friend from the park," she said. "I hope that's okay. You were supposed to be back by 5. My voice was sharp, cold. "Why didn't you answer your phone?" "Oh, it must have died, but everything's fine." She handed me a receipt. The shoes, another pair of designer toddler boots, cost more than my last week's groceries. I didn't say a word, just took Henry into my arms and went upstairs. But that night, I locked my bedroom door, for the first time in my own home. The next morning, I sat Henry down at breakfast and asked a question I hadn't dared before. "Sweetheart, what does Charlotte say when I'm not home?" He looked up from his cereal, innocent, chewing. "She says she's my better mommy." I blinked. "Better?" "She says you're tired, that you're busy, but she's always here. She said daddies don't come back, and sometimes mommies don't either." I felt my breath leave me. It wasn't just overstepping. It was indoctrination. I confronted her that evening. "Don't ever speak to Henry about me like that again. Do you understand?" She blinked, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you mean. You're poisoning my son against me." "I'm just being honest. He deserves stability. He deserves someone who doesn't stumble home exhausted and forget his bath schedule." "You work for me, Charlotte." She stepped forward, close enough to smell her citrus hand lotion. "That's where you're wrong, Elise. I work for him." Her eyes were cold now, unflinching, unapologetic. The agency sent me a new nanny within 48 hours. Her name was Liana. Young, qualified, a little nervous. I scheduled the transition for Friday, my day off, so I could supervise. Charlotte didn't take it well. "I wasn't informed about this. You're being replaced. Your services are no longer required." "You don't get to decide that." "Actually, I do." She left the house without another word, but not before kneeling to Henry, stroking his hair and whispering, "I'll see you soon, sweet boy. Mommy loves you." That night, I checked every lock, closed every blind. But even that couldn't prepare me for what came next. Because Charlotte hadn't just grown attached. She'd built a case. And the next week, she filed for emergency custody of my son. Block 3. Custody of a stranger. I stared at the email, blinking hard as if the words would shift into something sane. Petition for emergency custody. Filed. Case. NAR 2023 FL 782. Petitioner. Charlotte Hale. The blood drained from my face. Charlotte wasn't just delusional. She was weaponizing the very system meant to protect children. against their own parent. I called my lawyer that same afternoon, Julia McKinnon, a family law specialist I'd used during my probate process after Mason died. Her voice, usually cool and composed, cracked with disbelief. She filed as a psychological guardian, claims she has been the primary caretaker for over a year, and that you be emotionally unfit. She babysat, that's it. Not according to her. Attached to the petition were photographs, dozens of them. Henry and Charlotte reading, cooking, laughing. Screenshots of her daily logs. Notes she'd written, now twisted to frame me as absent, negligent, distracted. She even submitted texts, out-of-context messages where I'd thanked her for handling bedtime, managing his schedule, or saving me again. I was polite. She turned it into evidence. The hearing was set for 10 days later. 10 days of hell. I barely slept. Barely ate. I watched Henry like a hawk, terrified she'd show up at daycare. Or worse. Julia secured a temporary restraining order. But fear has long arms, and doubt, even longer. I started questioning myself. Every moment I'd spent at work. Every night I'd come home too tired to play. Every shortcut I'd taken just to function. Was I enough? Had I been enough? But then I'd look at Henry. The way he curled into me, whispered, "I missed you, Mommy," without prompt. Traced my face with his tiny fingers. And I knew. I was his mother. And she would not take him. At the hearing, Charlotte wore beige, her hair pulled into a low bun, no makeup, a demure cardigan. She looked like the mother every judge wants to see. And she spoke like one too. Henry cries when I'm not there. He calls me Mommy. I've been the one to teach him, bathe him, love him. Elise is overwhelmed. She's distracted. I stepped in because I had to, not because I wanted to. Lies, laced with just enough truth to be believable. My turn came. Julia guided me through carefully, presenting calendars, receipts, documentation that proved Henry lived with me, that I paid all his expenses, made all medical decisions, was present for all parent-teacher meetings and pediatrician visits, except one, the one she stole. I testified calmly, until the judge asked me the hardest question. Do you believe your son sees her as a mother figure? My mouth went dry, because the answer was yes. And yet, the truth was more complicated than the law allowed. He may be confused, I said. But confusion isn't consent, and it's not motherhood. The judge denied her emergency request, cited lack of standing. Charlotte stood up slowly, expression unreadable. But as she turned, she caught my eye, and smiled, not in defeat, in warning. Later that week, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside, a USB stick. On it, audio recordings. Private ones. Me venting on the phone, tired, sobbing, cursing the world. Conversations I'd had late at night in the kitchen when I thought I was alone. She'd been recording me. For months. Charlotte wasn't done. She hadn't just lost custody. She'd declared war. Block 4. She tried to erase me. The recordings hit the internet 2 days later. Not as direct uploads, but through an anonymous parenting blog. One with a quiet but devoted following of alternative caregivers. It posed as an exposé. The dark side of elite working moms, one nanny's story. The post didn't name me directly, but the details were unmistakable. Pasadena-based architect, recently widowed, single mother to a toddler named Harry. A mother who screamed into her wine glass, who forgot to change her son's sheets for 3 weeks, who once slept through his fever. Lies, twisted memories, edited audio, cherry-picked truths. I knew I shouldn't read the comments, but I did. How can someone like that raise a child? The nanny should have gotten custody. This is why women shouldn't have kids and careers. I vomited in the sink. At work, the whispers started within hours. My boss, Liam, called me into his office, He didn't say the blog, but he didn't need to. We've had concerns about your focus, your emotional bandwidth. You're not serious. Clients have asked about replacing you on the Templeton project, and HR's been alerted to some noise online. I sat there, stunned. My career, the one thing I clung to as proof I was still me, was slipping. Charlotte wasn't attacking just my motherhood. She was attacking my identity. I called Julia in tears. She's ruining my life, one post at a time. Julia was silent for a beat. Then it's time we stop playing defense. What do you mean? We sue for defamation, harassment, and violation of privacy. But more importantly, we prove she's dangerous. That meant digging. Hard. We hired a private investigator, Ken Morris, a grizzled ex-cop with a talent for uncovering what people try hardest to bury. And Charlotte? She had a lot to bury. False names on job applications. A sealed expunged record in Oregon, one that took serious leverage to crack open. And the big one, a previous employer, a mother, a child, all with similar accusations of overstepping, of claiming space that wasn't hers, but none had pressed charges. They'd just disappeared, moved, let it go. I wouldn't. Meanwhile, Charlotte escalated. She began showing up near Henry's daycare, never crossing the legal boundary, just lingering, like smoke. One day, Henry looked up from a drawing and said, "Mommy, Charlotte said she misses me. She said you were the one who left her." My throat tightened. She was still whispering into his world, planting seeds. I recorded everything, every incident, every appearance, every screenshot. Then Julia did something brilliant. She flipped the script. We went to court not to defend, but to protect. Filed for a protective order. Filed a suit for stalking, digital defamation, and identity invasion. It was risky, but it worked. Because in court, truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to show patterns. We presented Ken's findings. The blog? Traced to a VPN, but routed through a known burner email used in 2 of Charlotte's previous identities. The audio? Proven edited, context stripped. The timeline? Precise and chilling. The judge didn't just grant the protective order, she recommended criminal charges. Charlotte didn't flinch. Even as the ruling came down, she stood there, serene. But in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't before. Fear. Not of me, but of being seen. The illusion was shattered. But the war wasn't over. Because one post, one whisper, one doubt, can echo longer than any verdict. I still had to rebuild my world and protect Henry from the fallout. Because though Charlotte was legally gone, her shadow still clung to my life like smoke in an old sweater. Block 5. The recovery wasn't linear. Even after the court order was granted, I didn't sleep through the night. Every bump outside, every flicker of motion on the baby monitor sent my heart racing. Rationally, I knew Charlotte couldn't come near us. But trauma has its own timeline. It doesn't follow logic, it follows fear. I took 2 weeks off from work. Liam didn't fight it. Maybe out of guilt. Maybe because the agency's HR department had quietly shifted focus once Julia sent a pre-litigation notice. During those 2 weeks, I spent every moment with Henry. We rebuilt routines, brushed teeth together, walked barefoot in the garden, painted clouds on cardboard and called them sky windows. But the part that broke me came one afternoon while we were reading. He pointed at a picture of a bear cub and its mother. "Mommy," he said softly, "do bears get second mommies too?" I didn't answer right away. I pulled him close, kissing the top of his head. "No, sweetheart. Bears have one mommy, and they stay with her forever." He didn't say anything, but he smiled. And I cried quietly as he turned the page. At night, I sifted through the wreckage Charlotte had left behind. She'd scraped content from my personal blog, a page I hadn't updated in over a year. Personal essays, poems about grief, ramblings about late-night parenting. She'd twisted them, used them as part of her case. I deleted the blog. Then I sat down and wrote something new. A letter, not to her, to Henry. I didn't intend to give it to him yet. Maybe not for years. But I wrote everything. What happened. How I failed to see it. How I fought. And how no one, not even someone who claimed to love him, would ever take him from me. It ended like this. You didn't choose this chaos, but I'll spend the rest of my life showing you what real love, safe love, looks like. And I'll never let anyone steal your story again. The legal case against Charlotte moved slowly, as legal cases do. The criminal charges hadn't stuck. Her lawyer spun it as a misunderstanding, a mental health spiral, a sad situation gone too far. They cut a deal. Probation, no contact orders, mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Julia called it a win. I called it survival. 6 months later, I got an email from an editor at a parenting magazine. She'd seen coverage of the case in a legal blog. She wanted me to write about boundaries, about invisible violations. At first I balked. I didn't want to be a Nanny horror story headline. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just my story. It was happening everywhere. In quiet homes, behind curated Instagram posts, in the spaces where desperation meets dependence. So I said yes. The piece went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it was raw. I didn't write it as a warning. I wrote it as a map, for anyone who ever handed over trust and watched it morph into manipulation. The comments stunned me. This happened to my sister. We fired a nanny who started dressing like my wife. People don't understand how real this is. Thank you. The healing wasn't clean. Some days, Henry still asked about Charlotte. Some days, I still locked my bedroom door out of habit. But over time, those habits faded. What stayed was Henry's laugh. Liana, the new nanny, became a quiet presence. She never overstepped. She never crossed lines. And eventually, I started to believe that not every helping hand came with an agenda. But just when I thought the worst was over, Charlotte reappeared, not in person, but in a petition, filed anonymously. She wanted to sue me for emotional distress. She said I'd defamed her. She wanted money, not Henry, not my home. Just the one thing I had finally begun to rebuild. Peace. Block 6. A new kind of fight. The summons was slim, clinical. A manila envelope left at my doorstep by a courier who didn't know how to even make eye contact. Inside, 6 pages of carefully worded accusations. Charlotte Hale versus Elise Whitman. Grounds, defamation of character, intentional infliction of emotional distress, cyber harassment, $250,000 in damages. It wasn't about winning, it was about intimidation, silencing, dragging me back into her narrative, as if I were the villain and she the wronged party. Julia wasn't surprised. This is what abusers do when their manipulation fails. They try to reclaim power by shifting the story. But she has no case, right? Legally, it's weak. But we can't ignore it. And the PR risk is real. You wrote that article, publicly. So I should be quiet now? Because she's uncomfortable with consequences? No, Julia said, her voice sharp. You should fight smarter. We filed a counterclaim, not just denying her accusations, but laying out a detailed account of her past behavior, backed by documentation from the original custody case, the private investigator's findings, and the protective order. We added a request for sanctions, citing this as a clear abuse of the legal system. And then, I did something bold. I posted again. A follow-up essay titled, When Your Abuser Sues You for Telling the Truth. I didn't name her. I didn't reveal court details. I just told my side, raw, clear, unfiltered. The post blew up, shared by mental health advocates, legal professionals, parents who'd felt silenced. I wasn't just speaking for me anymore. I was part of a movement. But Charlotte wasn't done. She granted an interview to a tabloid blog, one that thrives on controversy and messy headlines. She painted herself as a misunderstood caregiver, caught in a system that punished empathy. I loved that boy. I still do. I was punished for caring too much. The article ran with the headline, "The Nanny Who Got Too Close, or Just Too Good." The comments were split. Some called her creepy, others called her courageous. But the article went viral, and suddenly I was fielding interview requests, talk shows, podcasts. I turned them all down, except one. It was a small mental health podcast hosted by a child psychologist named Dr. Nia Rivers. No flashy graphics, no tabloid energy, just space to speak, to unpack, to educate. That interview changed everything, because for the first time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was outlining a larger truth, that not all abuse is loud, that boundaries matter, even between caregivers and children, that sometimes the people who smile the warmest hide the darkest intentions. After the episode aired, something unexpected happened. 3 women reached out through my lawyer, all former employers of Charlotte, all with eerily similar stories, too afraid to speak until now. Julia filed a motion to consolidate testimony. The judge agreed, and suddenly, Charlotte's lawsuit didn't look like a victim's cry. It looked like a pattern. In court, her demeanor cracked. For the first time, she raised her voice, tried to turn the judge's questions into monologues, tried to control the narrative, but the facts were louder. When the final ruling came, it was swift. Case dismissed, counterclaim upheld. She was fined for legal misconduct and barred from working with children again, indefinitely. I sat outside the courthouse with Julia, watching the sunlight stretch over the parking lot. "That's it," she said. "You're free?" "Am I?" She looked at me, free enough to start again, without her shadow. I exhaled. It wasn't peace, but it was possible. Block 7. Picking up the pieces. The silence after the courtroom battle felt strange. It wasn't peaceful, not at first. It was eerie, like the stillness after a storm where the air is too clean, too quiet. I kept waiting for another shoe to drop, another headline to appear, another email from a lawyer's office. But nothing came. Days passed, then weeks. And slowly, my world began to breathe again. Henry was thriving. He had started preschool by then. A Montessori program filled with sunlight and structure and teachers who saw him as himself, not through the lens of court transcripts and trauma. One morning, I watched from behind the one-way glass as he handed a crayon to another little boy and said, "My mommy says kindness is like putting good magic in the air." I blinked back tears, not because of the words, but because he'd said my mommy. Singular. Sure. Unshaken. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Elaine Mark. She didn't come with soft lighting and endless affirmations. She came with truth, with challenge. She asked questions like, what would it mean to trust someone without control? When did survival become your default? What version of motherhood are you holding yourself hostage to? She wasn't there to tell me I was a good mom. She was there to help me believe it for myself. And it worked. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily. At work, things were less certain. The Templeton project had moved on without me. My role was quietly shifted, then phased into something peripheral. Eventually, I handed in my notice. Not in protest, in peace. Architecture had saved me once, but it wasn't who I was anymore. So I began freelancing, designing small spaces for women-owned businesses, working with nonprofits that helped single parents, using the money IDA won in the countersuit to fund a series of community co-op design studios. I named the first one Room to Breathe. Henry helped pick the paint colors. One night, months later, I ran into Charlotte's old employer, the one from Brentwood, at a charity auction. She recognized me instantly. We didn't say much, just nodded. But as she turned to leave, she said something that stuck with me. "You didn't just survive her, you ended her cycle. For all of us." I didn't reply. But inside, I felt something shift. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to my past. I was authoring my future. Still, there were remnants, shadows that crept in at dusk, moments when I heard Henry giggle in the next room and my chest clenched, waiting for the wrong laugh to echo with his. But each time, I breathed through it. And each time, it got a little easier. One evening, I sat on the porch with Henry. He was 5 now, scraped knees, a crooked smile, a sketchbook filled with rocket ships and dragons. He looked up at me and said, "I remember when Charlotte was here." My stomach tensed. "Do you remember how that felt?" He thought for a moment, then nodded. I was confused, but not anymore. "Why not?" "Because you're not scared anymore." I pulled him close. And in that moment, I knew he wasn't just safe. He was healing. And so was I. Block 8. What comes after survival? There's something strange about healing. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive like a letter or a court ruling. It sneaks in, quiet and slow, through the smallest acts. A full night's sleep without waking to check the locks. A photo of Henry and me on the fridge, one she didn't take. A moment of laughter where fear doesn't interrupt. These were my new victories. Not the loud kind, the lasting kind. I started dating again, carefully, quietly. It wasn't about replacing anything. It was about remembering who I was before Charlotte, before the constant fight to prove I was enough, to protect what was already mine. His name was Michael. He was a pediatric nurse, of all things. Gentle, funny. The kind of man who let silence be comfortable. Our first few dates, I didn't mention Charlotte, or courtrooms, or custody. I talked about art, about food, about Henry. He listened, didn't press, didn't perform. It felt normal. I didn't know how much I missed normal until I tasted it again. Henry liked him. That helped. Michael didn't try too hard. He showed up when invited, never overstepped, never called himself anything he wasn't. One night, after they'd built a pillow fort in the living room, Henry whispered to me, "You can keep him, Mommy. He doesn't pretend." And I knew exactly what he meant. By the next spring, the article I'd written had been reprinted in several journals. Universities began using it in psychology and family law courses. I was invited to speak, not as a victim, but as an advocate. I hesitated. Public speaking had never been my strength. But something inside me shifted. This story, my story, wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every parent who'd felt gaslit by someone they trusted, to every woman who'd been told her instincts were paranoia, to every child who'd been pulled between love and manipulation. So I spoke, first in a lecture hall, then on a panel, then in front of hundreds at a parenting summit in Chicago. My hands shook the whole time. But when I stepped off stage, a woman came up to me, eyes full of tears. "You just described my sister's life. She thought she was crazy. You gave her language." Back home, things were simpler. Not easier, but clearer. Henry was growing into a curious, kind-hearted boy. I kept writing. Michael stayed. Julia and I stayed friends too. She'd become more than my lawyer. She was my war buddy. My reminder that women could be fierce, brilliant, and soft all at once. Then, one morning, I opened my mailbox and found a letter. No return address. Inside, a single photograph of Charlotte, in what looked like a counseling group. Smiling, whole, alive. The message on the back read, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm trying to be someone worth it." I stared at it for a long time, then placed it in a drawer, not out of fear, but because closure doesn't always come through doors you can lock. Sometimes it comes quietly, like healing, like growth, like knowing that no one can ever steal your motherhood again. Block 9. The life I reclaimed. The seasons turned slowly that year. Henry learned to ride a bike, wobbly at first, then fearless. Michael planted a garden with us. Tomatoes, basil, and sunflowers that bloomed like small suns. And I began to breathe differently, not from relief, but from presence. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for a knock at the door, a legal notice, a ghost from the past. I was here. One evening, after Henry fell asleep, Michael and I sat on the porch. The stars were faint but visible. City living didn't hide them all. "You ever think you'd get here?" he asked softly. I thought for a long moment. No. And yes, I hoped, even when I didn't believe. He didn't respond with words. He just reached for my hand and held it. I started a podcast. At first, it was just an extension of the article, me reading pieces, answering questions from listeners, sharing resources. But it grew. Parents began writing in. Therapists, lawyers, survivors. We didn't just talk about boundary violations and custody nightmares. We talked about rebuilding, reclaiming, redefining safety, not just as a concept, but as a practice. The show was called Second Skin, a name Henry came up with. "Because you grew a new one," he said, "after the bad stuff." He was right. At one point, a journalist contacted me about writing a book. They wanted a memoir. I considered it. But I realized something. This story, though once mine, now belonged to more people than I could ever name. Turning it into a product didn't feel right. So instead, I partnered with a legal nonprofit. We created training materials for social workers and guardian ad litems, tools to help them identify emotional grooming, soft manipulation, the silent patterns Charlotte had perfected. Her tactics weren't unique, but now they'd be harder to repeat. Henry still asked questions from time to time. Why did Charlotte want to be my mom? Why did she lie? I never sugarcoated. I never vilified either. Some people confuse love with control, I said. They think if they're needed, they're loved. And when they're afraid, they act out of fear, not care. Did you forgive her? That one took longer. I forgave me first, I said. And then, I let her go. That summer, we took a trip. Just me and Henry. No phones, no work. Just us. We hiked, camped, watched fireflies without naming them. On our last night, we sat under the stars again, this time in the quiet of a national park. He leaned on me and whispered, "You're not scared anymore." And I realized he was right. I wasn't. Not of Charlotte. Not of shadows. Not even of what I'd been through. Because I had survived. More than that, I had evolved. Block 10. The ending I wrote myself. There's a kind of silence that lives after a storm, not empty, not heavy, but sacred. Like the world knows what it just endured. Like the universe lets you exhale for the first time in years. That was my life now. Not perfect, not untouchable, but real. A year after the final court dismissal, I hosted a small gathering. Friends, neighbors, a few of the women I'd met through the podcast. Julia came too, in her usual blazer and red lipstick, bringing a bottle of wine and her signature side-eye for anything mildly sentimental. Henry helped me set up. He insisted we use real plates. "Because it's not a party," he said. "It's a celebration." He was right. Midway through the evening, I stood to make a toast, not to survival, but to transformation, to the people we become after we've been tested, to the version of ourselves we never imagined we could be, until we had no other choice. To those who've been silenced and found their voice, to those who've been violated and built new boundaries, to those who've been rewritten and chose to tell their story anyway, and to the children, ours or others, who remind us every day what strength really looks like. Later, after the guests had left, I sat in the backyard, watching Henry chase lightning bugs with Michael. The air was warm, the sky full of soft stars. I closed my eyes and felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. Safe. Not just because Charlotte was gone, but because I had built a life where her absence wasn't the point. My presence was. I wasn't defined by the war she started. I was defined by the world I created after it ended. Henry ran up to me, breathless, holding a jar. Inside, one tiny light blinked gently. "It's not scared of the dark," he said. "Why's that?" "Because it makes light." I smiled. "Just like you." He beamed, then ran back to Michael. As I watched them, I thought of the other women, the ones still fighting, the ones still unheard, the ones still doubting their own stories because someone with charm and a smile made them feel crazy. And I whispered, to no one in particular, "Keep going, you're not alone." Because that was the truth. I'd made it through. And I wasn't the same. I was stronger, not in spite of the fire, but because I walked through it and carried my son out the other side.